December 5th, 2013, Nelson Mandela, the first black South African president, died at the age of 95. Many know him as a freedom fighter against apartheid, as well as an advocate for forgiveness and reconciliation and a world leader. Today, our guests will focus on their understanding and connection to Nelson Mandela before he arose to the presidency. Please stay tuned. Welcome to the show. I'm Karen Crozier, joined today by guest Carla Kirk, Director of African American Studies Program at Fresno City College, as well as Peter Smith, Assistant Professor of the Center for Peacemaking and Conflict Studies at Fresno Pacific University. Welcome to the show.
Thank you very much.
So much. Let's get right to the questions. Please share, beginning with you, Carla, your connections and insight on Nelson Mandela. What has he meant for you in your life and vocation as an educator of African American studies?
Nelson Mandela has been a tremendous inspiration for resolving the issues that we've had as a society with each other over the past several centuries. I look to Nelson Mandela as a way to maybe begin addressing some of the issues that we have here in our own country that deal with race and racism. He has been a model for reconciliation and looking to find a peaceful way to come to terms with a hard past, with a difficult past. And so as an African American instructor at Fresno City College, I do draw upon his lessons in forgiveness and looking forward, not holding the future generations responsible for past mistakes, but looking forward to build a stronger society, not just a nation, but a stronger society for everyone.
It is interesting you share that because our former President Bill Clinton indicated that when Mandela was released in 1990, he had brought his daughter, 10-year-old Chelsea, to the TV to watch this monumental moment of when he was being released. Mm-hmm. And when Clinton had the chance to ask him, when he became president, how did you let go? And Mandela informed him that if I would not have let go, I would have remained in the prison system. Yeah. And so that was one of the lessons as well our former President Clinton was able to take from the man Mandela. Peter, please share your connection to and insights on Nelson Mandela in your life in peacemaking studies and education.
Yeah, part of my journey in peacemaking has had me living in Zambia and teaching there for African students from across the continent. And I taught in a center that talked about peace building and talked about leadership, were kind of our two main things. And Mandela was a shining beacon of what leadership really ought to be in the African context in particular. And so it was always using him as kind of a reference point. Boy, this is somebody who did it well, who did it right, and then when it was time to step down, he stepped down. And there were so many other great leaders, or potentially great leaders, that we looked at in the African context who didn't know when to step down, couldn't step aside, couldn't give the power to someone else, and things like that. And so Mandela was a great example that way. And I think one of the things that really I take away from his life and his leadership is the moral power that he brought to his leadership. We could study his life and look for techniques, skills, policies, what did he do, and analyze it that way. But I think the real power of his life and work was the power that he brought, the moral power that began with this capacity, I think, to forgive, to release, and to practice that after he'd suffered so much. Really lent a lot of power to what he did.
Yeah, that's a nice segue into the next question. After he had suffered so much, 27 years in prison, and 18 of those years in an isolated island called Robben Island because of his response to apartheid. Please share, beginning with you, Carla, your understanding of the apartheid context the violence that was perpetrated on black South Africans during the time of Nelson Mandela?
From a historical perspective, my understanding of apartheid is very much linked to the Jim Crow era of American history. And from my studies, what I know is that the lessons of apartheid, which means separation, were learned from the American South and what was going on with the dominant society and the African American society at that time. The primary difference that I see between the two, it was the same structure. It was the same structure, segregation and separation, or apartheid. But the primary thing that I see is that, or the difference that I see, is in what we as African Americans suffer here in America, which is a land that is not our native land, and what South Africans went through in their native land. So it's the difference between being taken someplace and being mistreated, or being mistreated in your own home. One issue that I see is that African American students in my classes, and African American people in general, do not have a very good understanding of what we suffered here in America in the 30s and the 40s and the 60s was reflected in South Africa and was going on at the same time. To see that there's no real discrepancy in them, other than to be taken someplace and have this done to you, or have this done to you in your own home. The violence was abhorrent. It was a terrible, horrible time that in classes that do not go in depth as much as African American studies classes do not give you the entire birth of the violence that African Americans and South African people were suffering under oppressive rule.
You shared the word Jim Crow. Some of our viewers may not know what Jim Crow is. Can you please go into more detail of how you understand Jim Crow and the connection to South Africa apartheid?
Absolutely. The term Jim Crow comes from a character. It was a white man who in blackface would behave in a stereotypical negative way for African Americans as they were seen at that time. The term became applied to the era of segregation that's going to happen coming right out of the 1920s, going up through the civil rights movement. So the entire era was classified or identified as segregation in public accommodations and education, in public buildings, in services that are offered to American citizens that would not be offered to African Americans. And so it was a time that you separated African Americans out from the mainstream society. So that era, collectively, is known as the Jim Crow era. It really began more toward the beginning of the 20th century, but began to spread, I guess you could say, across the United States in the 20s and the 30s and the 40s. It was that time that South African people had come to the southern states, and there was kind of this idea of, oh, we like the way that you separate your black people from your white people, and we are going to adopt a system that's similar to that. Right. And that is where this word apartheid, which means separation, comes from.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Peter, what is your perspective concerning apartheid in South Africa?
Well, Carla said it well. You know, one of the apartheid museum in Johannesburg that I visited while I was in South Africa, which tries to give you something of the experience of what it's like. And so your entrance ticket that's printed out is randomly selected as a different color. And based on the color, you enter through two different doors to begin your tour of the museum. And through the one door, you get the white experience. Mm-hmm. Things are nice, things are given to you, things flow for you. You enter through the other one, the black door, as it were, and it tries to portray what it would look like to experience apartheid from that side. Very different realities. And yet this whole separation that it was all about was really about keeping those worlds separate. And white South Africans that I worked with and met while I was in Southern Africa talked about this separation like they didn't really realize what was going on. They didn't realize, because the separation begins to become isolation, begins to become insulation, and the lack of knowledge about what was happening to the majority population who were suffering under the apartheid laws and so forth was often unknown or unrecognized in many ways. So that the tragedy on that sense and goes to some of the ideas of white privilege that you've talked about on this show previously and so forth. But Mandela was adamantly against this and felt the full force of it, suffered under it, and was why he got involved in the ANC and eventually in the Spear of the Nation, right? The kind of militant arm of the ANC that said this has got to stop. This apartheid is unjust.
Right, so you want to continue with that with Mandela's leadership and goal, because in the midst of this situation when they're saying you are legally considered a second-class citizen, the law says you don't matter, and we have the right to impose that. So what do you think about Mandela's, we'll begin with you, Peter, as you was entering into that, his goal as he entered the ANC, the African National Congress, which was a black South African political movement to raise awareness around we're not drinking from the same water. Can you share more about how you saw Mandela's leadership role that included both the moral and the political in his response?
Well, let's remember that before he even gets exposed to the ANC or mixed up with the ANC, he's trained as a lawyer. And so, you know, you talk about laws that say you're a second-class citizen. Well, here he is studying the white man's laws and the laws of South Africa. And, I mean, it's got to be an enormous tension, enormous contradiction. Law is supposed to tell you this is the way things are, this is the way things ought to be, this is how we stand up for justice and order our society. And at the same time, you're getting these messages that say, you are second class, you don't really belong, you don't really have a voice. So he's really formed in the tension, I think, of that experience of studying law and then finding himself on the underside of these same laws that are, but that's not how it's supposed to work. Law is supposed to be the thing that orders things and holds us together. So that's very formative for Mandela, I think, and we ought to remember that. And then the laws then get used also to outlaw things that are very basic. So when the black South Africans begin to organize themselves into protests and boycotts, a new law springs up. Hey, you can't do that anymore. No boycotting, no protests. And what about this political party? We'll do this. And no political parties are allowed. You know, no gatherings. As soon as you try to say something and raise your voice, new laws come in. And of course, so it leads to when Mandela is put on trial, some of his famous words, right? I shouldn't be on trial here. The government ought to be on trial here for what they've done and for the way that they've set things up. There's a massive injustice here.
Carla, could you please share, many people think that when we as black people begin to raise questions, as Peter was saying, we are considered the rabble-rousers. Mm-hmm. But the problem is really being exposed about the treatment that is being perpetrated upon us. You want to share more about your perspective of Mandela's leadership and goal as he sought to end apartheid?
One thing that I have always admired about Nelson Mandela is that it was never an idea that he's going to rise to power and get revenge. There was no idea of, well, now that we're in charge, now we're going to show you what it's like. It was always what can we do to unify our nation, that we are equally South African. And I feel like his leadership pushed towards that, what Peter had said about knowing when you're an effective leader and when it's time to step away from that leadership and let other leadership come in. The focus
I'm going to have to stop you right here because we're going to have to take a break, but we will be back after 1 minute. Thank you.
KNXT, the nation's only full-powered broadcast station owned and operated by a Catholic diocese in the U.S. and streaming live on the internet at KNXT.TV, need your support to keep the message of the good news alive. Just go to KNXT.TV, click on the Make a Financial Gift, go to Donate, and fill out your one-time or monthly offering under PayPal. It's just that easy. Your donation makes it possible for KNXT, Catholic Television, to continue its ministry by celebrating the Mass and proclaiming the gospel. Thank you from KNXT.
Welcome back to the show. I'm Karen Crozier, joined today by guest Carla Kirk from Fresno City College, as well as Peter Smith from Fresno Pacific University. We left off with dealing with the leadership goals in response to apartheid of Mandela. Can you please pick back up where you left off, Carla?
Sure. I think just to summarize what I was getting to is that Nelson Mandela's goal was unification. It was not a dominance. It was not a retribution. It was not a retaliation, but the reconciliation to bring us all back, all of us back together as one nation. And that is something that I always admired and something that I emphasize when I do get to teach students about him. Unfortunately, many times in my classes, the first real experience they have with learning any of the history that's not portrayed in mass media.
So instead of being called a rabble-rouser, he should have been known during the time as a unifier,
As a unifier and a
peacemaker,
a
a reconciler, one who was not trying to make you look bad, but if you're looking bad, how can you own what is happening and do the right? Yes, so it gives us different language to look at those who we want to dismiss as mere rabble-rousers. When we look at those throughout history, such as King, Martin Luther King Jr., as well as those of us of the Christian faith, Jesus was also considered as a rabble-rouser by many people. What do you consider to be the similarities and differences between Jesus, King, and Mandela? Let's begin with you, Carla.
Okay. The similarities right offhand are they were men of peace. They were not men of dominance. They were men of collaboration and coordination and work and unifying. It seems that that term rabble-rouser usually it depends on history, where you fall in, what side you fall on in history. Beginning with Dr. King. Dr. King in this country was not really considered so much a rabble-rouser until his message began to move from this peaceful kind of coming together as a nation, as was his dream, to addressing issues of income inequality and our participation in the Vietnam War. All of a sudden, then Dr. King is no longer this patronly kind of person. With Nelson Mandela, to argue against a system of injustice to the people who are portraying the injustice upon you, then yes, of course, you're the one who says, well, you're the one causing the problem. Instead of looking at yourself, I think in psychology they call that projection. There's so much wrong with you that there's actually must be something wrong with me. And with Jesus Christ, yes. When we address this in class, and it's very, very sensitively that we have to do this at a community college, to let them know that this was a man who came to shake up the injustices that he saw, to shake up what was happening in their society with dominance and commercialism and capitalism, all of these things that come in that place one group above the majority. And I see what all three of these men have in common is that they fought against a system of injustice that was so much greater than they were, but they never let that diminish how they fought, how long they fought, or what they were willing to sacrifice for that fight.
Thank you. Peter, what do you see as the similarities and differences between Jesus, Martin Luther King, and Mandela?
Yeah, I think there's some very interesting comparison and contrast things you can do. I think the most obvious one is Dr. King and Nelson Mandela, both involved fundamentally in a racial situation where you were known by the color of your skin, and that set the terms of the engagement with the other, if you will, with the engagement with your oppressor. And I think that's a key common denominator between the two of them and what they had to face and how that worked out. But I was thinking about another aspect, another way to look at this, and drawing more on Jesus and think about the social context that they were in. I think Jesus and Mandela had similar situations because they both lived in times and places where the numerical majority was being oppressed by a numerical minority. The Romans did not have more people in Palestine. Jesus was a Palestinian Jew, and there were lots of them there, but the Romans controlled things. Likewise in South Africa. Black South Africans, there were millions of them, but the number of white South Africans, a small minority in comparison. So one wonders about what's the dynamic of being a part of a people who are numerically large, and yet we find ourselves in this second-class situation, and how do you respond to that? Of course, we could talk about Gandhi as well, who would fit that description too, with the British colonial occupation of India, and Gandhi famously saying, "How is it that 100,000 British can keep millions of Indians, subjected and in their place?" So there are some very interesting things there, but there also we could talk about strategies too.
Please share.
Shall I? Mandela, when he joins the Spear of the Nation, the African National Congress, more militant wing that I talked about earlier, they embarked then on a campaign of sabotage, of more saying the things that we're trying, the nonviolent action, the protests, the boycotts, these things are not working. We need to take bigger action, bolder action, something like that. And biblical scholars would tell us that this was a temptation for Jesus, that sometimes is called the zealot option, that there were zealots, or maybe known as freedom fighters in Jesus' day, who said, hey, the only way to get rid of the Romans is to rise up with our weapons and get them out of here. Let's make it tough on them. Let's throw them out of town. There's evidence that that was an option for Jesus. They were looking for a leader who could kind of rally the zealots and lead an army against the Romans. Jesus now resisted that temptation, so we'd have now a contrast where Jesus said, no, that's not the way to go, where Mandela embraced that, at least for a time, and eventually went to prison for it. Though we could have a probably longer discussion on whether Mandela repented from that or regretted that or thought that was a mistake.
Well, as I understand it, Peter, is that he never saw himself as killing white South Africans, but destroying the governmental structure to help them to become aware of, wow, look at the violence you're perpetrating on us, so please listen.
That's right.
To try to get another way to connect and have the conversation. Yeah. However, some people will still find that to be problematic, but that is the distinction, as I understand Mandela. And we never, true, within our gospel narratives, Jesus is never known of blowing up any synagogues.
As far as we know, that's right.
Or of going to Caesar's palace and said, this is wrong.
Right.
But in that process, when we look at Nelson Mandela, as you said, that possibly he repented for that later on, and I wonder, has that been noted anywhere? But along those lines, what can we as people of faith draw from the life of Mandela? Peter, let's begin with you.
Well, the theme that Carla mentioned early on about his forgiveness and capacity to forgive, I think is one that we would say that's part of our tradition and something that we hold dear. Unfortunately, we're not always great at practicing that, and so I think we need to continue to hold up exemplars like Mandela, who suffered these 27 years in prison in some very hard conditions. I visited Robben Island. It's not a pleasant place to be, and quite cold and so forth. And yet he can come through that and embody forgiveness, and it challenges all of us, right? What things are we holding on to that we ought to be letting go and practicing the release of the stranglehold that some things have on us? So I think there's a great thing that we need to allow these kind of exemplars to stand before us and challenge us in forgiveness, definitely.
Thank you. Carla, what are your thoughts?
It is not just the forgiveness, which is important, but a sense of optimism. And when you talked about the goals, a clear idea of what your goals are. Are your goals to equally oppress those who oppressed you? Or is your goal to unify and build a stronger future for your children? That's optimistic. When you're focused on revenge and retaliation, and let me show you what we lived, let me give you just a taste of what we lived through, or are we going to focus on moving beyond that, not forgetting it, certainly not forgetting it, but moving forward? Because what Peter said, if you're what are you holding on to? that's keeping you from moving forward. You cannot build a nation taking turns oppressing each other.
That's right.
What you have to do is come together. You have to reconcile what your differences are and begin to build a future for the generations that come after you that can look to you, that can look to you for what you did in the face of such adversity, to come forward and still love your people, love who you are, and love your nation.
So what about when the person that says, I don't want to reconcile with you? Which what we're dealing with even in 21st century South Africa, as I've been told. What do we do? 30 seconds or less. Peter, go for it.
You know, all we can do is continue to invite people to that, and I think and continue the invitation with open arms or open hands and say, wouldn't you like to? Wouldn't this be better? How's it working out for you? Holding on to your bitterness and your anger, usually that just eats people up. So I think our invitation is all. You can't force someone into reconciliation.
All right, Carla, what are your thoughts?
Again, to keep offering. You know, you don't change who you are to accommodate them. You say, well, what we are trying to do is stronger. It's stronger for our future. So I will continue to explain it to you. Maybe you don't understand maybe what we're trying to say. So let me continue to try to explain it to you and stay open to this possibility.
Well, thank you. I'd like to thank my guests for being on the show today. You can catch, if you missed any part of the show, you can catch it online at knxt.tv and then click on the YouTube icon. I thank you for watching today. Hope you have a wonderful day. Take care and God bless.